1958 would see the introduction of one of the most infamous cars in automotive history, and that would be the 1958 Edsel lineup. Edsels were sold from the 1958 through 1960 model years. Over the course of those three model years, about 118-ish thousand units were sold, and most of those were sold in 1958, where Ford sold about 68,000 units. In 1959, production dropped to 45,000 units. And then for the 1960 model year, Ford sold just a couple thousand units. It was Ford's hope that Edsel would take off and would sell about a couple 100,000 units per year. So it didn't even meet that expectation over 3 model years on a cumulative sales basis. Now, why did Ford introduce Edsel? Well, General Motors was highly successful with the Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, Cadillac philosophy. And over at Chrysler, they had something similar going in 1958, albeit for not that many years into the future, having the Plymouth franchise at the bottom end, the Dodge DeSoto lineup for the mid-range, Chrysler and Imperial at the uppermost end of the range. And Ford thought it needed something in between the Lincoln and Mercury at the upper end and Ford at the bottom end of the range. So Edsel was born, and in fact, the lower end Edsels for 1958, the Ranger, which was the lowest end model, and the Pacer, rode atop Ford chassis and had Ford engines. They had a 118-inch wheelbase, were powered by the E400 V8, which was the Ford Edsel 361 cubic inch FE V8 underhood. And then if you got an upper end Corsair or the top of the line Citation convertible being the absolute top of the line Edsel, you had a 124-inch wheelbase, and you had the MEL, Mercury Edsel Lincoln 410 cubic inch E475 V8 underhood. So for that inaugural model year, like I said, Edsels were really kind of a hybrid between Ford at the lower end and Mercury at the upper end. And I think a lot of buyers were confused about where Edsel was supposed to slot into the lineup. Was it above Mercury? Was it below Mercury? But clearly, Ford wanted it to slot in below Mercury, given that it was a mixture between Ford and Mercury, as I just previously mentioned. Now, interestingly, the Wagons, there was the Edsel Roundup at the lowermost end of the lineup. That was the cheapest wagon. Then there was the Villager, and then at the absolute top end was the Edsel Bermuda. And those rode atop a 116-inch wheelbase. So the wagon was actually the shortest wheelbase of all of them, and they were powered by the Ford Edsel V8s because, as we're going to see here, they were really based on Fords more than the chassis, in fact. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a step back for a moment and talk about the 1958 Edsel's design philosophy. Clearly, the front end is highly distinctive with the so-called horse collar grille. And what was the inspiration for this? Well, the designers of the Edsel thought that in the early 1950s, almost every car had this really horizontally oriented theme associated with it. So the designers wanted to have a different front-end signature that would really stand out. And as a consequence, they devised that horse collar grille or the toilet bowl, or there are a lot of different, let's say, nicknames for that particular front end. Nonetheless, it was clearly distinctive. And the other thing that you notice is on the body sides of the Edsel, you have this big scalloped out kind of pointy section. And that was also something that was, I would say, considerably emphasized across the car in various pickle emblems, as many people affectionately call them. And even in the front bumper, you can see kind of the scalloped out section. So the design theme on the car had that mixture between that very vertically oriented grille, you have that scalloped out section on the side, and out in the rear, you have kind of these batwing style horizontal tail lamps that really kind of completed the unique look. But the purpose of this video is not to go into a deep history on Edsel. We'll do that in another video. Rather, the purpose of this particular video is to kind of showcase something that's pretty amazing in terms of what Ford designers and engineers tried to do to disguise the underpinnings of the 1958 Edsel Wagons. Now, as I mentioned, the sedans, the coupes from Edsel, whether that was a Ranger, a Pacer, a Corsair, or a Citation, really had quite distinctive styling and unique sheet metal all the way around, with that horse-colored grille up front, the scalloped outside section, those tail lamps that kind of flared up and out. And you couldn't mistake the Edsel for anything else on the roadway. But when it came to the 1958 Edsel Wagons, they did retain that front-end unique sheet metal. But there were a number of cost-saving elements that were associated with the wagon. And I suspect this was because station wagons really weren't the highest volume vehicles back in the day. The Ford wagons, as an example, tended to sell about 150 to 200,000 units per year. And I think that Ford program planners knew that the Edsel wagon was going to sell considerably yet less from a units perspective. So they tried to devise a way and work with designers and engineers to make the Edsel wagons distinctive but save a lot of money, so that it didn't cost an incremental amount for tooling associated with producing the Edsel wagon. So the first thing that was a cost save was, I mentioned that the wheelbases for the Edsel Ranger and Pacer, that was a 118-inch wheelbase. The Citation Corsair would run atop 124-inch wheelbase. The 118-inch wheelbase was shared with the more deluxe Fords like the Fairlane. But the lower-end Fords, as well as the wagons, rode atop a 116-inch wheelbase. So if you got a Ford Custom or the Custom 300 lower-end car, you got the 116-inch wheelbase, which was the same as the wagon. You got the Fairlane. You got the 118-inch wheelbase. And Ford did that for many years. They would place their wagons on kind of the cheapest wheelbase or the shortest wheelbase, as opposed to GM and Chrysler that sometimes put their wagons on the longest wheelbase. So if you got the Ford, you had these huge rear overhangs, and the wagons were often shorter than the other variants of the vehicles. So the first step in the cost savings was employing the same Ford cheap 116-inch wheelbase for the Edsel wagon. But the most interesting piece for the Edsels in terms of a cost savings is that take a look at this side-by-side picture of the 1957 Ford wagon, not the 58 Ford wagon, and the 1958 Edsel wagon. Here it's a Bermuda, so the upper end Edsel wagon. Well, what do you notice? It's basically the same car. Now, there are some things that Ford designers and Edsel stylists tried to do to disguise this. Now, first of all, let's talk about what's common between these two vehicles. Pretty much everything aft of the front clip. Of course, the fenders, the hood are unique, but the windshield, the A-pillar, the roof panel even. Notice, see that little bump in the roof that the Ford has? You can identify it clearly on the Edsel wagon as well. Just, I would say, behind the B-pillar. The doors are the same. The glass of the front, the rear doors, the rear quarter glass is the same. Now, here's what's interesting is that it's even the same rear quarter panel. Although it doesn't look it at first glance, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And the fact that this is an Edsel Bermuda, it's a little hard to see. But notice that the Ford wagon has that feature line that starts in front of the rear wheel and kind of comes up and over and then touches the leading edge of the bumper. That is also on the Edsel wagon and on the quarter panel. Like I said, a little bit hard to see here because this is a dark colored Bermuda. But all of that is identical between the cars. Now, what did Edsel designers try to do to disguise the fact they were using a year-old Ford and the sheet metal associated with it for their wagon? Well, remember I talked about that scalloped out section on the Edsels. The first thing that you notice is that they changed the trim on the body side to have a similar kind of pointy pickle, if you will, that extended all the way forward into the front door and removed the check mark and the check mark trim that you see on the Ford wagon up top. So that's just a change in the various moldings and bright work on the car, not a change in the underlying sheet metal. But again, the Edsel designers were trying to get some of that same flair from the sedans and coupes into the wagon. Now, the most interesting thing is what they did to the rear quarter panel. And like I said, this is the same rear quarter panel. You'll notice that it has that convex section. First of all, it's got that little fin at the top. Then it's got a convex section underneath it. And you'll notice that the difference really comes in below that between the Ford and the Edsel Wagon. And you're probably about to say, well, hold on, those are not the same quarter panels. Those are clearly different quarter panels because of that little flare that the Edsel has underneath that convex section, what the Ford doesn't. But wait, I say. Now let's take a look at the rear of this 1958 Edsel Bermuda. And what do you notice? Well, first of all, you'll notice that there's kind of a round element to the tail lamp, which is a very weird tail light, by the way. The turn signals on the Edsel Bermuda, when you turn them on, if you flick the right turn signal, this arrow-like tail lamp would point left, which is kind of humorous. It should have been the other way around, but this was how the designers had to, I think, accommodate the sheet metal, and that's probably why it resulted in this. In any case, if you notice at the inset, the Ford wagon has the tail light in that round section. Here, there's the optional reverse light that is included in the tail lamp on the outboard section of this housing. And then you have kind of the boomerang style tail light. And the style of that tail lamp is facilitated by the fin on the 1957 Ford, at least the upper end of the tail lamp is. Well, how did the Edsel stylists kind of disguise this sheet metal from the 1957 Ford wagon and get the lower end of the tail lamp and the lower portion of the boomerang? Well, take a look, and a close eye will notice that the rear quarter panel has an applique that is just tacked on underneath that convex surface. See it starting there just behind the, I'll call it a rivet on the wood grain side trim, and extending back toward the tail lamp. And that allows that surface to change from one that really tucks in to one that flares outboard. So all that's different between the 1957 Ford and the 1958 Edsel Wagon in terms of sheet metal on this quarter panel is that applique. And then that applique sets up the tail lamp and allows the Edsel to have a much more distinctive rear that's different from the Ford, utilizing that same circular area for the tail lamp for the reverse lamp on the Edsel, and then allowing the boomerang style tail lamp to be employed and giving the rear end a totally different look. And here is a more holistic view of an Edsel wagon. You'll note, by the way, I was talking about that crease that started in front of the rear wheel and then continued on rearward. Well, you can see it here that was borrowed from the 1957 Ford wagon. And I think even the bumper was borrowed from the 1957 Ford wagon, except for that middle section, kind of that V shape or that U shape that is surrounding the license plate that was welded on and kind of tacked onto the bumper, again, to make it look different. Because everything else in this, the hatch, the rear glass, is 1957 Ford. You can also see what I mean about that applique and how it reshapes that portion of the quarter panel and sets up the so-called boomerang style tail lamp. Quite ingenious. Reminds me of on the 1977 Buick Estate wagon. I think they did that for 1977, 8, and 9. There was an applique that was on the front door all the way back to the outside rear view mirror that helped set up the styling of the front fenders, because those wagons used the same doors from Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick. But the Buick had styling that of the front end clip that really just needed that applique to smooth out the creases on the doors. So GM perhaps borrowed inspiration from this 58 Edsel in really devising that solution. And both were cheap. Now, was this a good idea or was this not? Well, in hindsight, it certainly was, because Edsel didn't sell that much in terms of units. And I think Edsel Wagons, they may have sold a couple thousand of them, and that was it in 1958. So it was super, super low volume. And so to employ the Ford sheet metal really made a heck of a lot of sense. But it is funny they employed the one-year-old Ford sheet metal in doing so. I suppose because the Ford got a newer look and they wanted the Edsel to look different, and so they thought that they could just reuse the sheet metal. But as I mentioned before, Edsel unfortunately would really start to go by the wayside after the 1959 model year. In 1959, Ford would really consolidate the lineup and get rid of this hybrid Ford Mercury in terms of the chassis and the engines. It really would become more of a Ford. And they would drop, as an example, the MEL V8s in 1959. You just had the FE V8s. And, after that, by 1960, it really was just a warmed-over Ford, unfortunately. A good-looking one, but a warmed-over Ford. So the Edsel failed, but I thought that you would enjoy learning about this cool little piece of history and how Ford Motor Company saved some money on the Edsel wagons for 1958 using that applique as opposed to coming up with a completely different quarter panel. What do you think? Did you know that? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.